The settlers formed a circle around the black woman who had arrived at the wrong ranch, their voices cutting through the Wyoming dust like broken glass. Ellie Williams clutched her torn letter of introduction, mud staining the traveling dress. She had pressed that morning with such care. The crowd pressed closer with each passing moment. Micah Bell stepped forward, his boots grinding against the dry earth. His voice carried the authority of a man who had never been questioned. "You lost, girl? This ain't no place for your kind." The other settlers nodded, their faces hard as winter stone. Someone had thrown the mud. Someone had torn her letter. The pieces scattered in the wind like dead leaves. Ellie's heart hammered against her ribs. She had come seeking the Morrison family, following directions written in careful script. The letter had promised work as a governess, a chance to teach children their letters and numbers. Instead, she found herself surrounded by hostile faces. In a ranch yard that belonged to strangers. The crowd tightened. Boots scraped against earth. Voices rose higher. Then the porch door opened. Arthur Morgan stepped into the afternoon light, his shadow falling long across the yard. The settlers turned toward him, expecting solidarity, expecting him to join their chorus of rejection. Arthur's eyes found Ellie's face. He saw the mud on her dress, the fear she was trying to hide, the torn paper at her feet. Something stirred. In his chest, something he had not felt since Mary died. "I want you." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. The crowd froze. Ellie stared at him, her dark eyes wide with confusion and something that might have been hope. Micah's face twisted. "What did you say?" Arthur stepped. Down from the porch, his boots heavy on the wooden steps. "You heard me," the crowd erupted. Voices clashed against each other, angry and disbelieving. Micah raised his hand for silence, his pale eyes fixed on Arthur. "You better think real careful about what you're saying, Morgan." Arthur walked closer to where Ellie stood. The settlers parted reluctantly, their formation breaking. He stopped. 3 feet away from her, close enough to see the intelligence in her eyes, the way she held her chin high despite everything. "I've thought about it." Micah's laugh was sharp as breaking wood. "You think you can just claim her? Like some stray dog? I think you can get off my land." The silence stretched between them. Wind moved through the dry grass, carrying the scent of approaching autumn. Ellie watched Arthur's face, trying to read the intentions behind his weathered features. "This won't stand," Micah said finally. "Community won't stand for it. Community can speak for itself." But the other settlers remained quiet, their eyes moving between Arthur and Micah like spectators at a prize fight. They had followed Micah's lead for months, accepting his word as law. Now something had shifted. One by one, they began to step back. Micah's face darkened. "You're making a mistake, Morgan. Bigger than you know, maybe. Think about Mary. Think about what she'd say." Arthur's jaw tightened. "Don't. She was a good woman. Respectable. This would break her heart. Mary's dead." The words hung in the air like smoke. Ellie felt the weight of grief in them, the way Arthur's shoulders set against some invisible burden. She understood then that this man knew loss the way she knew loneliness. Micah stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried across the yard. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. Send her on her way. Let things go back to how they were." Arthur looked at Ellie again. She had not moved, had not spoken, but something in her stillness reminded him of Mary's quiet strength. The way his wife had faced down criticism when she taught the preacher's children to read. The way she had stood her ground when the town ladies questioned her methods. "No." Micah's hand moved to his belt. "You're choosing her over your own people. I'm choosing what's right." The crowd shifted, uncertain. Some nodded slowly. Others frowned. The unity Micah had built was cracking like ice in spring. "This isn't over," Micah said. He turned to address the other settlers. "You all See what's happening here. Remember it. The crowd began to disperse, voices low and worried. They cast glances back at Arthur and Ellie as they walked away, their boots raising dust clouds that hung in the still air. Soon only Micah remained. You'll regret this, Morgan. Arthur waited until Micah's horse disappeared over the ridge before. Turning to Ellie, she stood exactly where she had been, her hand still clutching the remains of her letter. You hurt? She shook her head. Good. He looked at the torn paper in her hands. What was that about? A position. Teaching. Her voice was steady despite everything. I was supposed to find the Morrison family. No Morrisons here. I know that now. Arthur studied. Her face. The afternoon sun caught the gold in her brown skin, the determination in her dark eyes. She had not run when the crowd surrounded her, had not begged or pleaded. Just stood her ground and waited. What's your name? Ellie Williams. I'm Arthur Morgan. She nodded. Thank you. For what? Not letting them hurt me. Arthur looked toward the horizon where Micah had vanished. Day's not over yet. The truth of it settled between them like dust. Whatever Arthur had started with his declaration, it would not end with Micah's retreat. There would be consequences. There would be choices to make. But for now, they stood together in the fading light, two strangers bound by a moment of defiance neither fully understood. The dust settled around them like a shroud. Arthur rubbed his jaw, feeling the weight of what he had just done. The yard. Stretched empty now, but the echo of angry voices hung in the air. Ellie still held the torn letter. Her fingers worked the pieces, trying to make sense of scattered words. The paper was beyond saving. What did you mean? She asked. Arthur turned toward his house. The porch where Mary used to sit reading looked hollow now. Empty rockers caught the dying light. Mean about what, when you said you wanted me? The words sat between them like a loaded gun. Arthur felt heat rise in his neck. He had spoken without thinking, driven by something he could not name. Not what they thought. Ellie waited. The wind moved through the dry grass, carrying the scent of coming winter. Her traveling dress was ruined, mud ground into the fabric like shame. I need help with something, Arthur said finally. Been putting it off too long. What kind of help? Arthur looked at the house again. 2 years of avoidance had made it a monument to his grief. Mary's things still sat where she had left them, her books on the kitchen table, her sewing basket by the window, her dresses hanging in the wardrobe like ghosts. My wife died 2 years back. Haven't touched her things. Ellie studied his face. She saw the way his shoulders carried the weight of loss, the way his hands clenched when he mentioned Mary. Grief had carved lines around his eyes. You want me to go through her belongings? Someone should benefit from them. Mary would have wanted that. The offer hung in the air. Ellie had nowhere to go, no family expecting her, no money for passage back east. The Morrison position had been her last hope. What about your neighbors? What about them? They won't like this arrangement. Arthur spat in the dirt. They can mind their own business. But even as he said it, both of them knew it was not that simple. Small communities had long memories. What had happened in the yard would spread through the territory like wildfire. Where would I stay? Arthur nodded toward a small building behind the main house. Mary used that for her sewing, has a bed, a stove. You'd be safe there. Safe. The word carried weight neither of them wanted to examine. Ellie looked at the little cabin, its windows dark but clean. It was more than she had hoped for an hour ago. What about payment? Keep what you can use, sell the rest, keep that too. It was generous beyond reason. Too generous. Ellie felt the familiar prickle of suspicion that had kept her alive this long. Why? Arthur was quiet for a long moment. He watched the sun sink toward the horizon, painting the sky the color of old blood. Mary taught children to read, in secret. Community didn't approve. He looked at Ellie's ruined letter. You came here to teach. Maybe that means something. The connection was thin as spider silk, but it was enough. Ellie nodded slowly. I'll do it. Arthur led her to the cabin. The door stuck slightly, swollen from disuse. Inside, dust motes danced in the fading light. A narrow bed sat against one wall, covered by a quilt that smelled of lavender and thyme. There's a well out back. Woodshed's got plenty of fuel. Ellie set her traveling bag on the bed. The cabin was small but clean, with a woman's touch in. The careful placement of furniture, Mary's touch. I'll start tomorrow, she said. Arthur nodded and turned to leave. At the door, he paused. Ellie? She looked up from unpacking her few belongings. They'll try to make you leave. Micah and the others, I know. You don't have to stay. She pulled her Bible from the bag, its leather cover worn smooth by her mother's hands. I don't have anywhere else to go. Arthur left her then, walking back to the main house through the gathering dusk. Ellie watched him go, noting the way he moved with careful purpose, each step deliberate as a prayer. She lit the oil lamp and examined the cabin properly. Mary's presence lingered in every corner. A half-finished quilt folded on a chair. Spools of thread arranged by color. Books stacked on a small table. Books. Ellie ran her fingers along the spines. Poetry. Philosophy. Primers for teaching children. The collection spoke of Anne. Educated woman, someone who valued learning above social approval. She opened one of the primers. On the first page, written in careful script, knowledge is the only true freedom. The words resonated in the small space. Ellie thought of her own education, hard-won and precious. Her mother scrubbing floors to pay for books. Her father reading aloud by candlelight until his eyes gave out. Outside, night settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket. Somewhere in the darkness, Micah was planning his next move. The community was choosing sides. Arthur was wondering what he had gotten himself into. But in the cabin, surrounded by Mary's books and the lingering scent of lavender, Ellie felt something she had not felt in months. Purpose. She pulled out a chair and sat at the small table. Tomorrow she would begin sorting through a dead woman's belongings. She would learn about Mary Morgan through her possessions, understand the woman who had taught children in secret and died before her time. Tonight she would read. The lamp flame flickered, but held steady. Outside, the wind carried the sound of distant hoofbeats, riders moving through the darkness with unknown intent. Ellie heard them pass and kept reading. She was not running anymore. Morning came gray and cold. Arthur found her already at work in the main house, sorting through Mary's books with careful hands. She had made coffee and set a cup for him on the kitchen table. You're up early, he said. Old habit. She had tied her hair back and rolled up her sleeves. The ruined traveling dress had been replaced by a simple work dress from her bag. She looked different in the morning light, determined. Find anything interesting? Ellie held up a primer. Your wife had strong opinions about education. Arthur took the book, running his thumb over the cover. The pages fell open to a passage Mary had underlined. A mind once expanded can never return to its original dimensions. She was always reading, he said quietly. Always learning something new. Did she teach you? The question caught him off guard. Arthur set the book down, his face carefully neutral. Some, it was not the whole truth. Mary had tried to teach him, but Arthur had been too proud, too set in his ways. He could manage his name in simple sums, but the deeper learning had eluded him. She would have liked you, he said instead. Ellie looked up from the books. How can you know that? Because she helped people, even when it cost her. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Arthur finished his coffee and headed for the door. He had cattle to check, fences to mend, the endless work of keeping a ranch running alone. Arthur? He turned back. Thank you for the chance. He nodded and left her to her work. Outside, The morning air carried the promise of winter. Change was coming whether they were ready or not. 3 days into sorting Mary's belongings, Ellie found the hidden compartment. Her fingers traced the false bottom of the cedar chest, feeling the slight give in the wood. The panel lifted to reveal a collection of letters tied with blue ribbon. The first letter was addressed to the territorial governor. Mary's handwriting flowed across the page in careful loops, describing a plan to establish a school for all children, regardless of background. The second letter was to a women's education society in Denver, requesting teaching materials and funding. The third letter bore Ellie's name. She sat back on her heels, staring at the envelope. Missy Williams, it read in Mary's distinctive script. The postmark was dated 6 months ago, just weeks before Mary's death. Arthur's boots sounded on the porch. Ellie folded the letter quickly and slipped it into her apron pocket. The other correspondence went back into the hidden compartment. "Finding much?" Arthur asked as he entered. "More than I expected." Ellie held up a stack of children's primers. She was collecting teaching materials. Arthur nodded, his eyes distant. "Always had plans, big ones." "Did you know about her correspondence with the territorial government?" Arthur's hand stilled on his coffee cup. "What correspondence?" "Letters about establishing the school, official ones." The silence stretched between them. Arthur set down his cup and moved to the window, looking out at the empty yard where Micah's confrontation had played out days before. Mary had ideas about changing things, making them better. "You didn't approve?" "I didn't understand." The admission hung in the air like dust. Arthur turned back to face her, his weathered features etched with old regret. "She wanted to teach everyone, all the children around here. Said learning was a right, not a privilege. What did you think?" "I thought she'd get herself in trouble." The words carried the weight of prophecy. Ellie felt the letter in her pocket, its edges sharp against her fingers. Whatever Mary had planned, it had died with her. "She tried to teach you too." Arthur's jaw tightened. "Some, but you didn't let her." "I was too proud, too set in my ways." Ellie moved to the bookshelf and pulled out a basic primer. The pages were worn from use, marked with pencil notes in the margins. Mary's handwriting, mixed with someone else's, someone learning to form letters. "She was patient," Ellie said quietly. Arthur stepped closer to see what she was looking at. His breath caught as he recognized his own clumsy attempts at writing scattered throughout the book. "She never gave up on anyone," he said. "Even when it was hard, even then." The afternoon light slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Ellie opened the primer to a page where Arthur had practiced writing his name. The letters were uneven but determined, each one a small victory. "Would you like to continue?" Arthur looked at her, surprise flickering across his face. "Continue what?" "Learning to read. Properly, I mean." The offer settled between them like a bridge across dangerous water. Arthur had avoided books since Mary's death, unable to face the reminder of his own limitations. "Why would you do that?" "Because Mary would have wanted it. Because you deserve to know what she was trying to teach you." Arthur was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass, carrying the scent of distant rain. Change was coming whether they welcomed it or not. All right. They started that evening after supper. Arthur sat at the kitchen table where Mary used to read, his large hands awkward on the small book. Ellie sat across from him, patient as stone. "Sound it out," she said when he stumbled. Arthur's face reddened with effort and embarrassment. The words that came easily to others fought him at every turn. But Ellie waited, never rushing, never showing impatience. "Good," she said when he managed a complete sentence. "Mary would be proud." The praise hit him harder than criticism. Arthur cleared his throat and turned the page, determined to prove worthy of his wife's faith. As the lessons continued over the following days, something shifted between them. The careful distance they had maintained began to crack. Arthur found himself looking forward to the evening sessions, to the quiet concentration on Ellie's face as she guided him through difficult passages. Ellie discovered that Arthur's struggles with reading came not from lack of intelligence, but from never having been taught properly. His mind was sharp, his memory keen. He simply needed patience and practice. "You're getting better," she said one evening as Arthur read aloud from one of Mary's journals. "Mary always said I would, if I stuck with it. She was right." Arthur looked up from the page. "About a lot of things." "Like what?" "Like people deserving chances. Like learning being important." The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. Arthur was thinking of the confrontation in the yard, of his instinctive defense of Ellie when the crowd surrounded her. "Like you deserving to be here," he added quietly. Ellie felt heat rise in her cheeks. The kitchen suddenly seemed smaller, the space between them charged with unspoken understanding. "I should check on the horses," Arthur said, standing abruptly. After he left, Ellie sat alone at the table, Mary's journal open before her. She turned the pages slowly, reading about a woman's dreams for her community, her hope for a better future. The letter in her apron pocket seemed to burn against her side. She pulled it out and held it to the lamplight, seeing the shadow of words through the envelope. Her name written in a dead woman's hand. Outside, Arthur moved through the barn with practiced efficiency, checking on the animals and securing the property for the night. But his mind was on the kitchen, on the woman who had brought Mary's dreams back to life. He thought about the way Ellie's face lit up when he successfully read a difficult passage. The way she spoke of education with the same passion Mary had shown. The way she had stood her ground against the hostile crowd without backing down. Mary would have liked her. More than that, Mary would have trusted her. The realization hit him with the force of revelation. Arthur stopped brushing the horse and stared into the darkness beyond the barn door. Whatever had driven him to defend Ellie that first day, it was more than impulse. It was recognition. When he returned to the house, Ellie was reading by lamplight. She looked up as he entered, her face serene in the golden glow. "Find anything interesting in Mary's things today?" Ellie's hand moved unconsciously to her apron pocket. "Just more books, more evidence of her plans. She had a lot of them. Good plans, important ones." Arthur sat back down at the table, the primer still open between them. "Maybe we should continue what she started. The lessons, all of it. The school, the children." The words hung in the air like a promise. Ellie felt the weight of possibility, the chance to fulfill a dead woman's dreams while building something new. The community would never accept it. Maybe they don't have a choice. Outside, the wind carried the sound of distant hoofbeats. Riders in the darkness, moving with purpose. Arthur tensed, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle by the door. "Company," he said quietly. Ellie blew out the lamp, plunging the kitchen into darkness. Through the window, they could see torches moving across the landscape, heading toward the ranch. "Stay inside," Arthur said. But Ellie was already moving, her hand finding his in the darkness. "We face it together." The hoofbeats grew closer, bringing with them the promise of trouble. Whatever was coming, it would test the fragile alliance. They had built in the quiet of the kitchen, surrounded by books and the ghost of Mary's unfulfilled dreams. The hoofbeats passed without stopping. Arthur waited until the sound faded before lighting the lamp again. His hands were steady, but his eyes remained fixed on the darkness beyond the windows. "False alarm," he said. But Ellie saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers drummed against the table. Nothing was false about the fear that had gripped them both. "They'll be back. Maybe, not maybe, definitely." Arthur looked at her across the lamplight. "You scared? Terrified? But not of them. Of what then?" Ellie's hand moved to her apron pocket where Mary's letter waited. "Of what I might find out." The next morning brought Sheriff Dutch van der Linde to the ranch. He rode alone, his badge. Catching the early sun. Arthur met him in the yard, rifle cradled in his arms. "Morning, Dutch." "Arthur." The sheriff's eyes moved to the cabin where Ellie was hanging laundry. "Heard you got yourself a house guest." "Heard right." "Folks are talking." "Folks always talk." Dutch shifted in his saddle. "Some talk's more dangerous than others." "Arthur." Stepped closer to the horse. "That a threat? Warning?" "From a friend." "What kind of warning?" Dutch's eyes moved to the cabin again. Ellie had stopped hanging clothes, but continued to watch them, her hands still on the wet fabric. "Micah's organizing, getting people worked up. Says you're making the mockery of decent folk." "Since when is Micah the voice of decency?" "Since he started buying up half the territory." The words hit Arthur cold. He looked up at Dutch, seeing something new in the sheriff's weathered face. Fear. "What do you mean buying up?" "Taxes, Arthur. Property tax has been raised. Most folks can't pay. Micah's been buying the liens." Arthur's grip tightened on the rifle. "How much has he bought?" "Enough to matter. Enough to have influence." "With who?" Dutch looked away. "With whoever needs to be influenced." The silence stretched between them. Arthur understood now why Dutch had come alone, why he looked more nervous than threatening. "You on his payroll, Dutch?" "I'm trying to keep the peace." "That's not what I asked." Dutch straightened in his saddle. "You got 24 hours to send her away, Arthur. After that, I can't protect you. Don't remember asking for protection. Mary would have wanted you to be smart about this." Arthur's face went stone hard. "Don't you bring Mary into this. She's already in it. Was from the beginning." Dutch wheeled his horse around and rode away, leaving Arthur standing in the dust with questions burning in his chest. When he looked toward the cabin, Ellie was gone. He found her in the main house, pulling books from the shelves with urgent hands. Mary's correspondence was spread across the kitchen table, letters organized by date. "You heard." "I heard enough." Ellie held up a letter from the Territorial Tax Office. Mary was investigating property assessments. "Look at the dates." Arthur examined the letter. It was dated 3 weeks before Mary's death, questioning why tax valuations had increased so dramatically in their county. She was asking questions. Dangerous questions. More letters revealed the scope of Mary's investigation. She had been corresponding with other counties, comparing tax rates and assessment methods. The pattern was clear. Their county was being systematically overtaxed. Why would she care about taxes? Ellie pulled out another letter, this one from a family in the next valley. Because families were losing their land. Children were being forced to leave before they could learn to read. She was trying to help them. She was trying to expose corruption. Arthur sank into a chair, the weight of understanding settling on his shoulders. "That's why she died. That's why they killed her." The words hung in the air like gunsmoke. Arthur looked at the letters scattered across the table, seeing his wife's careful handwriting documenting crimes he had never suspected. "How do you know?" Ellie pulled Mary's letter from her pocket. The envelope was addressed to her, but the contents were explosive. Mary had detailed Micah's tax scheme, Dutch's complicity, and the threat to her own safety. She knew she was in danger. She was trying to get help. Arthur read the letter twice, his face growing darker with each line. Mary had suspected her death was coming. Had tried to prepare for it. She was going to expose them. She was going to bring you into it, you and me together. "What do you mean?" Ellie showed him the final paragraph of the letter. Mary had requested Ellie's help not just as a teacher, but as a witness. Someone from outside the community who could testify to the corruption if something happened to Mary. She planned this. All of it. The school was just the beginning. She wanted to clean up the whole territory. Arthur stood and moved to the window. Outside, the land stretched empty and beautiful, hiding the rot beneath its surface. His wife had seen what he had missed, had died trying to fix what he had ignored. What do? We finish what she started. They'll kill us too. Maybe, but Mary didn't run. Neither should we. Arthur turned back to face her. Ellie stood surrounded by evidence of his wife's courage, her dark eyes fierce with determination. She looked fragile in the morning light, but Arthur knew better now. She was steel wrapped in silk. You don't owe her anything, or me. I owe her everything. She gave me a chance to matter. This will destroy us. Not doing it will destroy us anyway. Micah won't stop with threats. Arthur knew she was right. The confrontation in the yard had been just the beginning. Micah's power was growing, his influence spreading. Soon he would own enough land to control the entire territory. We need more evidence. We need to stay alive long enough to present it. Where? The territorial capital, the governor's office. Arthur looked at the letters again. Mary had been building a case, documenting crimes, preparing for a legal battle. But she had run out of time. It's a long way to the capital. Mary made the journey twice, in secret. How do you know? Ellie showed him train tickets hidden in Mary's correspondence. Round trip to Denver, dated just a month before her death. She was already fighting. We just didn't know it. The pieces fell into place. Mary's secretive behavior in her final weeks. Her insistence on handling mail herself. Her sudden interest in property law. She was building a case. She was building a revolution. Arthur sat back down, overwhelmed by the scope of his wife's hidden activities. The woman he thought he knew had been leading a double life, fighting battles he never suspected. Why didn't she tell me? Because she knew you weren't ready. Not then. And now? Ellie gathered the letters into a neat stack. Now you have a choice. Honor her memory by finishing her work, or let Micah bury the truth along with her. The choice was no choice at all. Arthur had failed Mary in life by not understanding her dreams. He would not fail her in death by abandoning her cause. What do we do first? We find the rest of her evidence, and we prepare for war. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon. The wind carried the scent of rain and trouble, change coming whether they were ready or not. The community gathered at sundown in the old schoolhouse, summoned by word of mouth and the promise of resolution. Arthur and Ellie arrived together, her carrying a leather satchel filled with Mary's evidence, him with his rifle resting across his saddle. The building was packed. Families who had lost their land sat in the back rows, their faces hollow with defeat. Micah's supporters clustered near the front, their voices loud and confident. Sheriff Dutch stood by the door, his hand resting on his gun belt. Micah waited at the front of the room, positioned behind the teacher's desk like a judge. His smile was sharp as winter wind. Folks came to settle this business once and for all, he announced, as Arthur and Ellie took seats in the middle of the room. Time to put an end to this shameful situation. The crowd murmured agreement. Arthur felt the weight of hostile eyes on his back. Ellie sat straight beside him, her hands folded over the satchel. Arthur Morgan's made his choice, Micah continued. Chosen outsiders over his own people. Chosen scandal over respectability. That's not what this is about, Arthur said, standing. Then what is it about? Arthur looked around the room, seeing faces he had known for years. Neighbors who had shared meals at his table. Friends who had mourned with him at Mary's funeral. It's about truth. Micah's laugh was sharp. Truth? You mean the truth about what goes on at your ranch? About the arrangement you got with that woman? The crowd stirred, hungry for scandal. Arthur felt heat rise in his neck, but Ellie's hand on his arm kept him steady. I mean the truth about why families are losing their land. About who's getting rich while honest folks lose everything. The murmuring stopped. Micah's smile faltered. You're talking nonsense, am I? Arthur nodded to Ellie. She stood and opened the satchel, pulling out Mary's carefully organized correspondence. My wife was investigating property tax fraud. She documented everything. Ellie's voice carried clearly through the room. Mary Morgan spent months gathering evidence of illegal tax assessments. She found proof that county officials were inflating property values to force sales. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Dutch moved closer to the front, his face pale. "That's a serious accusation," he said. "It's a documented fact," Ellie replied. She held up a letter. Mary wrote to the territorial governor 3 times. She received confirmation that your county's tax rates were 40% higher than anywhere else in the territory. Micah stepped forward. "You expect us to believe some papers you probably forged? I expect you to explain why you've been buying tax liens on properties you helped overvalue." The accusation hit the room like lightning. Families in the back rows began to stand, their faces changing from resignation to anger. "That's a lie," Micah said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Then explain this." Ellie pulled out a document Arthur had never seen before. "A letter from you to the county assessor, recommending specific properties for revaluation. Properties you later bought at tax sales." The room erupted. Voices raised in anger and disbelief. Dutch moved his hand to his gun, but Arthur was already standing, his own weapon ready. "Let her finish," Arthur said quietly. The crowd fell silent. Ellie continued reading from Mary's correspondence, each document another nail in Micah's coffin. Property assessments that tripled overnight. Tax bills that couldn't be paid. Families forced to sell to the only buyer available. "Mary died trying to expose this," Ellie said. "But she left enough evidence to finish what she started." "She died in an accident," Micah protested. "Did she?" Arthur stepped forward. "Mary was a careful writer. Never had an accident in 20 years. But she dies just weeks before meeting with the territorial governor." The implication hung in the air. Several families nodded, remembering their own suspicions about Mary's death. "This is all speculation," Dutch said, but his voice was shaking. "Then let's speculate about your bank account," Arthur replied. "About how much Mike has been paying you to look the other way." Dutch's hand moved to his gun. Arthur was faster, his rifle rising to cover the sheriff. "Easy, Dutch. No need for that." The tension crackled through the room. But instead of fear, Arthur saw something else in the faces around him: recognition, understanding, the pieces clicking into place. "My family lost our place 6 months ago," said a voice from the back. "Taxes went up overnight. Had to sell to Micah for half what it was worth." "Same here," called another voice. "Tax bill doubled." No explanation. More voices joined in, families sharing stories of impossible assessments and forced sales. The pattern was clear. Micah had been systematically stealing land through legal manipulation. "You got no proof," Micah said desperately. "We got plenty," Arthur nodded to Ellie. "Mary documented everything. Every illegal assessment, every fraudulent sale, every bribe paid to county officials." Ellie pulled out the final piece of evidence. Mary's last letter, written the day before her death, detailing her planned meeting with the governor and her fear for her safety. "She knew she was in danger," Ellie read. "She knew certain people would kill to keep this secret." The words echoed through the silent room. Dutch's gun hand was shaking now, his face gray with sweat. "What do we do?" asked a woman whose family had lost their farm. "We take this evidence to the territorial capital," Arthur said. "We demand justice for Mary and for everyone who lost their land. And if they won't listen, then we make them listen." The crowd began to move, families gathering around Arthur and Ellie to examine the evidence. Dutch backed toward the door, his authority crumbling. "This ain't over," Micah said, but his voice carried no conviction. "Yes, it is," Arthur replied. Mary made sure of that. The meeting broke up with families talking in urgent clusters, planning their next moves. Some wanted to ride to the capital immediately. Others wanted to confront the county assessor. Arthur and Ellie walked out together, the weight of the satchel lighter now that its contents had been shared. The stars were bright overhead, the air clean and cold. "Think it'll work?" Ellie asked. Mary thought it would. "That's enough for me." They stood in the darkness outside the schoolhouse, watching their neighbors organize for the fight ahead. The community that had been divided was coming together, united by shared injustice and the promise of justice. What happens now? Now. We finish what she started. And after that? Arthur looked at the woman who had helped him understand his wife's dreams, who had shown him how to read the truth in written words. After that, we build the school Mary wanted, teach the children she died trying to help. Together? Together, the word carried weight beyond its simple meaning, a partnership forged in crisis, tested by community pressure, and proven by shared purpose. Not the romance the hostile crowd had imagined, but something deeper. A commitment to honor the dead by serving the living. The wind carried the sound of horses and voices, the community mobilizing for justice. Change was coming whether the corrupt officials were ready or not. Arthur and Ellie walked back to the ranch together, the satchel empty but their purpose clear. Tomorrow they would begin the long journey to the territorial capital. Tonight, they would plan the school that would rise from the ashes of Mary's sacrifice. The future stretched before them, uncertain but no longer alone. 6 months. Later, the sound of children's laughter carried across the ranch yard where hatred had once gathered. Arthur stood on the porch where he had first declared his protection of Ellie, watching small figures race between the old schoolhouse and the new well. The territorial governor had acted swiftly once presented with Mary's evidence. Micah Bell sat in prison awaiting trial. Dutch van der Linde had been stripped of his badge and faced his own charges. The fraudulent tax assessments had been overturned, land returned to rightful owners. Justice had come slow but certain, carried on the backs of Mary's careful documentation and the community's newfound courage. Ellie emerged from the schoolhouse, her arms full of slates and primers. The children followed her with eager faces, their lessons complete for the day. She had kept her promise to Mary, teaching without regard for background or birth. How did they do today? Arthur asked as she approached. Better than yesterday. Not as good as tomorrow will be. Her smile carried the satisfaction of work well done. The school served 23 children now, drawn from families across the territory. Some traveled hours each way, their parents determined to give their children what they had been denied. Arthur watched a boy struggle with his letters, tongue poking out in concentration. 6 months ago, that same determination had driven Arthur through his own lessons with Ellie. Now he read fluently, devouring the books Mary had collected. "Mrs. Patterson sent word," Ellie said. "She wants to enroll her youngest next month. That's the last holdout family. People change when they see results." Arthur nodded toward the children playing in the yard. Hard to argue with that. The transformation had been gradual but unmistakable. Families who had lost their land were rebuilding. Children who had never held books were reading stories. The community that had been divided by fear was united by hope. Getting late, Arthur observed. Ellie rang the bell that had once called Mary's secret students. Children scattered toward waiting horses and wagons, their voices carrying promises to return tomorrow. Parents nodded respectfully to both Arthur and Ellie, their gratitude evident. In small gestures, the Adams family lingered, their youngest daughter reluctant to leave. She had been the first to master the primer, her hunger for learning insatiable. "Can I take this home?" she asked, holding up a book of poetry. "Of course, but bring it back so others can enjoy it too." The girl nodded solemnly and climbed into the wagon beside her father. He tipped his hat to Arthur and Ellie, the same man who had stood with Micah's mob 6 months earlier. "See you tomorrow, Miss Williams. Tomorrow, Ellie agreed. As the last wagon disappeared over the ridge, quiet settled over the ranch. Arthur and Ellie stood together on the porch, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. The evening ritual had become precious to both of them, a moment of peace after the day's work. "Letter came from the governor's office," Arthur said. "About the teacher training program? They approved it. Full funding." Ellie's smile was radiant. The program would train teachers for rural schools throughout the territory, spreading Mary's vision beyond their small community. "When do we start?" "Next month. If you're willing to take on more students." Mary would have wanted it. Arthur looked at the woman who had helped him understand his wife's dreams, who had shown him how to honor the dead by serving the living. Their partnership had grown from desperate necessity to deep respect to something harder to name. "She would have been proud of you," he said. "Of us." The correction carried weight. They had built something together, something that would outlast them both. Not the scandal the hostile crowd had imagined, but a legacy of education and justice. "Think she would have approved?" Arthur asked. "Of the school?" "Of us." The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Their relationship had evolved beyond teacher and student, beyond partners in justice. Somewhere in the quiet evenings and shared purpose, they had found something neither had expected. "She brought us together," Ellie said quietly. "Through her letters, her plans, her dreams. I think she knew what would happen. Mary always was too smart for her own good. Smart enough to know you needed someone to carry on her work. Smart enough to know I needed someone to carry on with." The admission settled between them like a prayer. Arthur had loved Mary with the devotion of a young man. His feeling for Ellie was different, built on shared struggle and mutual respect. "The children need both of us," Ellie said. "They do. The school needs both of us. It does. I need you." The words were simple but profound. Arthur turned to face her fully, seeing the woman who had arrived at his ranch seeking work and found a calling. "I need you too." They stood close now, the space between them charged with possibility. But neither moved to close the distance. What they had built was too precious to rush, too important to risk. "Tomorrow," Arthur said. "Tomorrow," Ellie agreed. The word carried promise beyond the next day's lessons. Tomorrow they would continue Mary's work. Tomorrow they would teach children to read and write and dream. Tomorrow they would build the future Mary had envisioned. The stars emerged, one by one, painting the sky with light. Arthur and Ellie remained on the porch, comfortable in each other's presence, planning lessons and sharing dreams. In the distance, a night bird called to its mate. The sound carried across the land that had been torn by greed and hatred, now healing under the patient work of education and justice. The school bell sat silent in the growing darkness, ready to call tomorrow's students. Mary's books waited in neat rows, their knowledge eager to be shared. The future stretched before them, uncertain but no longer alone. Arthur and Ellie walked inside together, leaving the porch where everything had begun. The house that had been a monument to grief was now a home filled with purpose. Mary's presence lingered in every corner, not as a ghost, but as a guide. They had work to do, children to teach, dreams to fulfill, a community to heal. The task would take years, maybe decades, but they had time. They had each other. The ranch settled into peaceful quiet, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. In the schoolhouse, primers lay open to pages marked with small fingers. In the main house, lesson plans covered the kitchen table where Arthur had learned to read. The wind carried the promise of rain, of growth, of change. The future was coming whether they were ready or not. But for the first time in years, Arthur and Ellie were not afraid. They were ready, and that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel, and if you enjoy our content, Click this video on your screen. I promise you, it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.